So imagine it's the year 397. A half Berber, half Roman man in Africa sits down to write a book. It's the first work of autobiography written in the West. Christianity is a new concept for most of the world. Because he's Catholic, he calls it Confessions. We know him now, of course, as St. Augustine. He's a sinner, a thief, a liar, the father of a child born out of wedlock. He will leave the child's mother in order to become a priest. His faith is a battle, a struggle, a story. It's 1946. A man who is the son of two artists who both die while he's still very young sits down to write a book. World War II has just ended, and the bloody gashes in the land and bodies left by the war in millions will take decades to heal if they ever do. The man is a Trappist monk. It's a religious order that values silence and mandatory prayer 7 times a day. Last summer, I stood on the porch of this hermitage where Thomas Merton lived in Kentucky and drank a bottle of wine with one of his novices. So if you'd like to hear the gossip, see me afterwards. To become Christian, Thomas Merton has to leave everything behind. His friends, his brother, and he too is a sinner. He's a drunk, he's a liar, he's the father of a child born out of wedlock too. He calls this book the 7-story mountain, and in Dante's telling, that's the mountain that leads sinners out of purgatory. It's 1952. A woman in the Bowery in New York sits down to write a book. She is a single mother, an unwed mother, the mother of the many who come streaming into the houses of hospitality that she runs throughout the city. These have unlocked doors and open windows in neighborhoods where most of us would not want to walk at night. Dorothy Day is an anarchist, a socialist, a journalist, a suffragette arrested and jailed for standing up for the rights of women, the poor, anyone on the margins. Like Merton, her conversion to Catholicism cost her family and friends, but it helped to found the Catholic worker movement, where the poor come first. The FBI file on her is as thick as a fist. Her book, reflecting the depth of her own search for faith, is called The Long Loneliness. It's 2015. You all know who this guy is. Pope Francis stands on the floor of Congress, the first pope to address the American government, and what does he mention? 4 great Americans: Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, Thomas Merton, Dorothy Day. Google searches for Merton and Day hit a frantic spike. Their books, which people have read for decades in a steady trickle, all of a sudden are bestsellers on Amazon. And imagine the person who's never heard of these two and picks up one of these books and starts to read it, and they realize something, that these stories of activism and faith are life stories. Across the centuries, following in the footsteps of Augustine, they're called to write spiritual autobiographies. Every summer for the past few years, I've taught a class on spiritual autobiography, and my students have ranged from a gay Baptist minister to college students who are agnostic, Quakers, Buddhists, Muslims, Jews, people we would refer to as none of the above, and people we would refer to as all of the above. I am from Berkeley. And every one of those people comes to class because they have a story to tell. So why is it that so many of us are drawn to telling our faith stories? As we've heard from some of our other speakers, we live in what many people consider to be a secular time. Of course, here in America, we were founded on the idea that church and state are separate for a reason. But for many, many years, Christian thinking dominated our lives. Let's face it, today that is less so. Almost 40% of those under 40 like to call themselves NONES, and I'm really tired of having to spell that out after 3 years of working on this book. They're nuns, they're none of the above, but that doesn't mean that they're not religious. They just don't belong to one particular religion. It doesn't mean they don't believe in God. It doesn't mean that they lack compassion for the marginalized. It doesn't mean that they don't want community. They just don't look for those things in a church. And all around us, houses of worship are shrinking and closing. The Catholic Church may look particularly bleak to some. Only 16% of those under 40 regularly go to Mass. So, a lot of doom and gloom in discussions of religion today, and it's easy to see why people feel pessimistic. On the other hand, there's this. People keep writing their spiritual autobiographies. Secularism doesn't stop us from having religious and spiritual experiences. And we want to share them with others. But even with Augustine, Merton, and Day, across all these centuries, we might ask the same question. Why are these stories so compelling? Spiritual autobiography is an act of defiance. Augustine, Merton, and Day were each told, you're not smart enough, obedient enough, good enough to be Catholic. They were scrappers and fighters, and they had to battle their way through obstacles. By writing down their stories, they defied expectations. Spiritual autobiography is also an act of claiming your faith. One day when I was at church, I was surprised and a little bit embarrassed in the middle of the homily to realize that the priest was telling this story about this woman who was struggling with her faith because she was a journalist who wrote about religion. Guess who he was talking about? Lesson learned. If you don't tell your own story, someone else will. Telling your story is an act of claiming your faith, of framing it and owning it. Think about Martin Luther King, who shared his faith as part of his story he told people, and how it moved us as a nation towards doing something about the suffering of African Americans. Or Cesar Chavez, who would walk during the farm workers' strikes holding a banner of Our Lady of Guadalupe. They claimed their faith. They told it to others, and change became real. Spiritual autobiography is an act of being irrational in a time that values the rational. Patty has eloquently reminded us of how much we rely on our smartphones. Answers to everything are seconds away. Religious experiences, however, remain inexplicable. You can't Google an answer to them, and you can't Google your way towards faith in God, although I'm sure Google's working on that. Putting the irrational into words is a way of showing others, hey, this happened. I can't explain it. It doesn't make sense. It's real. Spiritual autobiography is a way for people who feel alienated or marginalized by religion to find their place. The writer Richard Rodriguez says this best, so I'm going to quote him. When people ask him how he can be Catholic and gay, he says, well, how could I not be Catholic? It's not something I chose. It's chosen me. It feels larger than me. It encompasses me. Think of something that encompasses you that you love. Put words to it. That is spiritual autobiography. Augustine's most famous prayer from the Confessions tells us that he came to God late, and he struggled and fought, and he kicked against faith. And don't we all do that every day? And yet, don't we have moments of transcendence, awe? Don't we have moments when we're down at the bottom and something pulls us back up? Put a name to it. Tell someone. Write it down. It's yours. Thank you.